This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our conversation with MIT professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident and linguist. He's written over 100 books, including Gaza and Crisis. I spoke with him on Thursday in the midst of the initial 72-hour ceasefire. I asked Professor Chomsky about Congress unanimously passing resolutions last month in support of Israel.
That's right, and that's exactly what we have to combat by organization and action. Take South Africa again. It wasn't until the 1980s that Congress began to pass sanctions. As I said, Reagan vetoed them and then violated them, and they were passed over as vetoed. But at least they were passing them. But that's decades after massive protests were developing around the world. In fact, BDS-style tactics, there was never a BDS movement, but BDS-style tactics began to be carried out on a popular level in the United States, beginning in the late 70s, but really picking up in the 80s. That's decades after a large-scale actions of that kind were being taken elsewhere, and ultimately that had an effect. Well, we're not there yet. You have to recall, it's important to recall that by the time Congress was passing sanctions against South Africa, even the American business community, which really is decisive in determining policy, had pretty much turned against apartheid. It just wasn't worth it for them. And as I said, the agreement that was finally reached was acceptable to them. Difference from the Israeli case. We're not there now. Right now, Israel is one of the top recipients of a U.S. investment. Warren Buffett, for example, recently bought a couple of $1 billion, bought some factory in Israel, an installment, and said that this is the best place for investment outside the United States. Intel is setting up its major new generation chip factory there. Military industry is closely linked to Israel. All of this is quite different from the South Africa case. We have to work. It'll take a lot of work to get there, but it has to be done.
And yet, Noam, you say that the analogy between Israel's occupation of the territories and apartheid South Africa is a dubious one. Why?
Many reasons. Say the term apartheid. In the occupied territories, what Israel's doing is much worse than apartheid. To call it apartheid is a gift to Israel, at least if by apartheid you mean South African-style apartheid. What's happening in the occupied territories is much worse. There's a crucial difference. The South African nationalists needed the black population. That was their workforce. It was 85% of the workforce of the population, and that was basically their workforce. They needed them. They had to sustain them. The Bantustans were horrifying, but South Africa did try to sustain them. They didn't put them on a diet. They tried to keep them strong enough to do the work that they needed for the country. They tried to get international support for the Bantustans. The Israeli relationship to the Palestinians in the occupied territories is totally different. They just don't want them. They want them out, or at least imprisoned. That's and they're acting that way. That's a very striking difference, which means that the apartheid analogy, South African apartheid to the occupied territories, is just a gift to Israeli violence. It's much worse than that. If you look inside Israel, there's plenty of repression and discrimination. I've written about it extensively for decades. But it's not apartheid. It's bad, but it's not apartheid. So the term I just don't think is applicable.
I wanted to get your response to Gior Elan, a former Israeli national security advisor. Speaking to the New York Times, Elan said, quote, "You cannot win against an effective guerrilla organization when on the one hand you're fighting them, and on the other hand you continue to supply them with water and food and gas and electricity. Israel should have declared a war against the de facto state of Gaza, and if there's misery and starvation in Gaza, it might lead the other side to make such hard decisions." Noam Chomsky, if you could respond to this.
That's basically the debate within the Israeli top political echelon. Should we follow Dov Weissglass's a position of maintaining them on a diet of bare survival? So you make sure children don't get chocolate bars, but you allow them to have, say, Cheerios in the morning. Should we?
Actually, Noam, can you explain that? Because when you've talked about it before, it sort of sounds more. This diet sounds like a metaphor. But can you explain what you meant when you said actual diet? Like you're talking number of calories. You're actually talking about whether kids can have chocolate.
Israeli experts have calculated in detail exactly how many calories, literally, Gazans need to survive. And if you look at the sanctions that they imposed, they're grotesque. I mean, even John Kerry condemned them bitterly. They're sadistic. Just enough calories to survive. And of course it is partly metaphoric because it means just enough material coming in through the tunnels so that they don't totally die. Israel restricts medicines, but you have to allow a little trickle in. When I was there right before the November 2012 assault, visited the Khan Yunis hospital, and the director showed us that they don't even have simple medicines, but they have something. So the diet, and the same is true with all aspects of it. Keep them on a diet literally, and the reason is very simple, and they pretty much said it. If they die, it's not going to look good for Israel. We may claim that we're not the occupying power, but the rest of the world doesn't agree. Even the United States doesn't agree. We are the occupying power. And if we kill off the population under occupation, not going to look good. It's not the 19th century when, as the U.S. expanded over its territory, its national territory, it pretty much exterminated the indigenous population. Well, by 19th century's imperial standards, that was unproblematic. This is a little different today. You can't exterminate the population in the territories that you occupy. That's the dovish position, Weissglass. The hawkish position is Eiland, which you quoted. Let's just kill them off.
And who do you think is going to prevail as I speak to you in the midst of this ceasefire?
The Weissglass position will prevail because Israel just, it's already becoming an international pariah and internationally hated. If it went on to pursue Eiland's recommendations, even the United States wouldn't be able to support it.
Interestingly, while the Arab countries, most of them, have not spoken out strongly against what Israel has done in Gaza, Latin American countries, one after another, from Brazil to Venezuela to Bolivia, have. A number of them have recalled their ambassadors to Israel. I believe Bolivian President Evo Morales called Israel a terrorist state. Can you talk about Latin America and its relationship with Israel?
Yeah, just remember, the Arab countries means the Arab dictators, our friends. It doesn't mean the Arab populations, our enemies. But what you said about Latin America is very significant. Not long ago, Latin America was what was called the backyard. They did whatever we said. In strategic planning, and very little was said about Latin America because they're under our domination. If we don't like something that happens, we install a military dictatorship or carry back huge massacres and so on. But basically, they do what we say. Last 10 or 15 years, that's changed. And it's a historic change. It's for the first time in 500 years since the conquistadors, Latin America is moving towards degree of independence of imperial domination, and also a degree of integration, which is critically important. And what you just described is one striking example of it. In the entire world, as far as I know, only a few Latin American countries have taken an honorable position on this issue. Brazil, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, El Salvador have withdrawn ambassadors in protest. They joined Bolivia and Venezuela, which had done it even earlier in reaction to other atrocities. That's unique, and it's not the only example. It was a very striking example, I guess maybe a year or so ago. The Open Society Forum did a study of support for rendition. Rendition, of course, is the most extreme form of torture. What you do is take people you don't like, and you send them to your favorite dictatorship so they'll be tortured. Grotesque. That was the CIA program of extraordinary rendition. The study was who took part in it. Well, of course, the Middle East dictatorships did. Syria, Assad, Mubarak, and others, because that's where you sent them to be tortured. Gaddafi. They took part. Europe, almost all of it, participated. England, Sweden, other countries abetted the transfer of prisoners to torture chambers to be grotesquely tortured. In fact, if you look over the world, there was only really one exception. The Latin American countries refused to participate. Now that is pretty remarkable. For one thing, because it shows their independence, but for another, while they were under U.S. control, they were the torture center of the world. Not long ago, a couple of decades ago. That's a real change. And by now, if you look at hemispheric conferences, the United States and Canada are isolated. The last major hemispheric conference couldn't come to a consensus decision on the major issues because the U.S. and Canada didn't agree with the rest of the hemisphere. The major issues were admission of Cuba into the hemispheric system and steps towards decriminalization of drugs. That's a terrible burden on the Latin Americans. The problem lies in the United States, and the Latin American countries, even the right-wing ones, want to free themselves of that. U.S. and Canada wouldn't go along. These are very significant changes in world affairs.
I wanted to turn to Charlie Rose interviewing the Hamas leader Khaled Mashal. This was in July. Mashal called for an end to Israel's occupation of Gaza.
This is not a prerequisite. Life is not a prerequisite. Life is a right for our people in Palestine. Since 2006, when the world refused the outcomes of the elections, our people actually lived under the siege of 8 years. This is a collective punishment. We need to lift the siege. We have to have a port. We have to have an airport. This is the first message. The second message, in order to stop the bloodletting, we need to look at the underlying causes. We need to look at the occupation. We need to stop the occupation. Netanyahu doesn't take heed of our rights. Mr. Kerry, months ago, tried to find a window through the negotiations in order to meet our target, to live without occupation, to reach our state. Netanyahu has killed our hope, killed our dream, and he killed the American initiative.
That is the Hamas leader, Khaled Mashal. In these last few minutes we have left, Noam Chomsky, talk about the demands of Hamas and what Khaled Mashal just said.
Well, he was basically reiterating what he and Ismail Haniyeh and other Hamas spokespersons have been saying for a long time. In fact, if you go back to 1988, when Hamas was formed, even before they became a functioning organization, their leadership, Sheikh Yassin, who was assassinated by Israel, others, offered settlements, proposals, which were turned down. And it remains pretty much the same. By now it's quite overt. It takes effort to fail to see it. You can read it in the Washington Post. What they propose is they accept the international consensus on a two-state settlement. They say, yes, let's have a two-state settlement on the international border. They say they don't go on to say we'll recognize Israel. But they say, yes, let's have a two-state settlement and a very long truce, maybe 50 years, and then we'll see what happens. That's been their proposal all along. That's far more forthcoming than any proposal in Israel. But that's not the way it's presented here. What you read is all they're interested in is destruction of Israel. What you hear is Bob Schieffer's type of repetition of the most vulgar Israeli propaganda. But that has been their position. It's not that they're nice people, like I wouldn't vote for them, but that is their position.
$6 billion of damage in Gaza right now. About 1,900 Palestinians are dead. Not clear, actually, how many, as the rubble hasn't all been dug out at this point. 500,000 refugees. You've got something like 180,000 in the schools, the shelters. And what does that mean for schools? Because they're supposed to be starting in a few weeks when the Palestinians are living in these schools, makeshift shelters. So what is the reality on the ground that happens now as these negotiations take place in Egypt?
Well, there is a kind of a slogan that's been used for years. Israel destroys, Gazans rebuild, Europe pays. It'll probably be something like that until the next episode of Mowing the Lawn. And what will happen, unless U.S. policy changes, what's very likely to happen is that Israel will continue with the policies it has been executing. No reason for them to stop from their point of view. And it's what I said, take what you want in the West Bank, integrate it into Israel, leave the Palestinians there in unviable cantons, separate it from Gaza, keep Gaza on that diet under siege, of course keep the West Golan Heights, and try to develop a greater Israel. This is not for security reasons, incidentally. That's been understood by the Israeli leadership for decades, back around 1970, I suppose. Ezer Weizmann, later the Air Force general, later president, pointed out correctly that taking over the territories does not improve our security situation. In fact, probably makes it worse. But he said it allows Israel to live at the scale and with the quality that we now enjoy. In other words, we can be a rich, powerful, expansionist
But you hear
country.
repeatedly, Hamas has in its charter a call for the destruction of Israel. And how do you guarantee that these thousands of rockets that threaten the people of Israel don't continue?
First of all, Hamas charter means practically nothing. The only people who pay attention to it are Israeli propagandists who love it. It was a charter put together by a small group of people under siege, under attack in 1988, and it's essentially meaningless. There are charters that mean something, but they're not talked about. So, for example, the electoral program of Israel's governing party, Likud, states explicitly that there can never be a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. And they not only state it in their charter, that's a call for the destruction of Palestine, explicit call for it. And they not only have it in their charter, their electoral program, but they implement it. That's quite different from the Hamas charter.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned linguist, political dissident. He's written more than 100 books, among his latest, Gaza in Crisis. I interviewed him on Thursday amidst the initial 72-hour ceasefire in Gaza. This hour was part 2 of our conversation. If you missed part 1, go to democracynow.org. You can also get a DVD of the full interview at democracynow.org.